I got a good one today. Kelli White. So, Kelli White is a wine writer. She's the author of two books that, when taken together, are going to tell you everything you need to know about where wine is and where it needs to go. So, her first book was Napa Valley Then and Now. So, this was an award winning history of Napa's vineyards and vintners. It's just a beautifully designed book, and it lives on wine professionals' shelves. Her second book, Wine Confident, says there's no wrong way to enjoy wine, and it invites newcomers to stop worrying about whether they're doing it right. She has all the credentials. So before she was a writer, she was a decade at Veritas in New York. She was at Napa's Press, and Food and Wine named her one of the top sommeliers in the country in 2013. And now she is the director of education at the Wine Center at Meadowood in Napa Valley. So she's got a really cool background. Finally, we get to Napa Valley. Ladies and gentlemen, Kelli White. Well, Kelli, welcome here. I'm really excited to have you.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So what's really interesting about you, obviously, I know you kind of from press and being this author and kind of the famous person from Napa, and we're going to get into all that. But I really want to know how you got here, because when I was doing my research, obviously, I find out that you start from a very different place than wine. So let's talk a little bit about your background and how this all happened.
Sure. Well, I guess I grew up in central Massachusetts with, I would say, exactly zero exposure to wine. I don't come from a family of drinkers, certainly not wine drinkers, and so didn't have any of that guiding me. But I did have a lot of, I would say, academic aptitude. So I ended up going to a science and math high school, and then going to a university to study neuroscience, which is, I think, is what you are teeing me up to talk about,
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
So, I mean,
obviously, everybody in wine seems to come from like a different background, but
yeah.
neuroscience obviously is a very different kind of discipline. So, yeah, how did that kind of transfer from your studies into where you ended up? Nah.
Well, it's a funky story, but I was majoring in neuroscience at Brandeis University and working in a neurogenetics lab, and then I was fortunate enough to receive a Howard Hughes Fellowship for independent research. So I did my own experiment that summer, and at the end of the summer, I had money left over and a little bit of time, and I had a friend that was studying abroad in Paris. So I went to visit them, and that was really my first exposure, not just to wine and restaurants, which I wasn't, still not really a drinker at this point at all. So just like a little bit, but it was cool. It seemed like the thing to do. But also, museums and art and things like that. That was really my first exposure to any of that, because I grew up, first of all on a chicken farm, and then in like a very rural place, and with a family of limited income, and so it's not like we were going into the city and going to the museums as a child. So it was this huge unlock of this unknown world of the greater humanities and sort of a different lifestyle, and it was very attractive. So even though I was doing well in my chosen field, I came back and immediately changed my major to art history. So I had 2 years to kind of hurry up and finish that, and then ended up graduating just completely confused as to what I was going to possibly do. So I worked for Cell Press for a while, which is a kind of a collection of academic magazines that do scientific research, like Neuron, is one of the more famous, Cell, of course, and before committing, and then worked at an art museum in the deserts of Texas in Marfa at the Chinati Foundation. So kind of still giving both the sides of the brain a shot before committing officially to wine in like 2025, because I had been working in wine part-time since my junior year of college in wine shops, and I loved it, but I still thought these other things would be, one or the other would be my career. And then when I chased them down even a little bit, I kept coming back to wine.
Yeah, it's so 20, 25 years old, not last year. I think you
Yeah.
meant, right? Yeah. And so you were kind of in this
That's
developmental
like
stage.
2005, right? 2005.
2005. And at some point, you end up out in Napa, which is kind of the theme of today, to talk a little bit about how people are attracted to Napa, what sort of things that we can learn a little bit about what being out in Napa does for the wine industry generally. But talk a little bit about that transition, because I think that's pretty significant part of your story.
Yeah, I was working as a sommelier, fast forward several years. I'm now in New York City working as a sommelier at Veritas. And Veritas at the time, it's since closed, but for those that are aware of it, it was one of the bigger wine lists, I think in the world. It was like, one of the kind of 2-inch thick wine list, pretty important place, lots of depth, but mostly European wines. And my now husband was a sommelier kind of in various places, but his longest stint was at Oriole. And when the market crashed, in August of 2008, the sommelier profession went through some considerable contraction, right? Where you had even, a lot of people certainly lost a considerable amount of money, and that affected fine wine consumption. But also, you had even people that still had it weren't showing that they had it, right? So people were less inclined to kind of demonstrate that they were actually okay. And so as a result, restaurants closed, wine lists shrank, and a lot of sommeliers lost their jobs. So this was the same moment when Hong Kong dropped its sin tax, and sort of the auction world, but also just felt like a lot of momentum of the fine wine world shifted to Hong Kong. So we briefly looked into moving to Hong Kong, but ultimately decided to do something completely different because my husband had wanted to learn how to make wine, and so we tried to move to wine country. And originally we were going to move to the Mosel, but we couldn't get work visas
Oh,
at the time because Europe was also struggling, and so they weren't really giving work visas to foreign nationals unless there was like a super compelling reason. And Harvest Intern really wasn't that. So we ended up getting a job offer in Napa. So Leslie Rudd, who has since passed, and at the time owned Rudd Winery and Press Restaurant, was looking to take his wine list to the next level. And he had met Scott, and he hadn't met me, but he had a lot of respect for Veritas and kind of hired us, pretty much on the spot when he heard we were looking to share the wine directorship. So we moved out in May of 2010, and that was the beginning of our time in Napa Valley.
so as an aside, how was that experience working together? I Before press, had you been working side by side, or was that your first opportunity to work
No, this
together
was our
together?
first time working side by side, and it's intense. I would say, I think it's fair to say that he liked it more than I did. I think when you work together, I think you kind of have to start counting the relationship in dog years, rather than human years, because it's a lot. And for some people, it's the most wonderful thing. I think there's a lot of great things about it. I personally have a really hard time not taking work home, whereas he's, a master of compartmentalization. And so it was too hard for me to like be annoyed with him at work and then come home and then somehow cease to be annoyed. It didn't work. So, but we did work side by side for a long time. And in fact, he took the photographs for my first book, the Napa book. So we also worked together on that. So it was very, very, very collaborative, and started a wine brand together. So we were really quite bound.
So I was going to get to the book. I will get to the book because it is a beautiful book. And so we'll
Thank
give
you.
him some credit for the photography, which I actually didn't realize. But um, talk a little bit about the experience. Obviously, you're in the wine world and you show up in Napa, and obviously, Press is extremely well known as kind of one of the premier, if not the premier, wine list in Napa. So, talk a little bit about that transition, how you felt and how you were accepted there.
Well, I would say there was a couple of things going on. I'm sure you're familiar with the New Yorker poster that has like the New Yorker's perspective of the world, and it's like New York, and then the rest of the world is like this. And I think I certainly felt that way. That it felt like an adventure, that we were moving to somewhere really. I mean, even though Napa is famous, it just seemed like it was going to be a much smaller world. And so it was shocking to me when we got to Napa Valley, and, Karen McNeil lives here. And James, at the time, James Suckling had a house here, and the Wine Spectator had headquarters here. And Robert Parker was always out here, and we would see Jancis Robinson out here, and some of our regulars from New York, even though when we knew them in New York, they would drink European wine, would come to
Right.
Napa or had homes here. So it was just, it would, and there's a ton of masters of wine and masters sommeliers here, and obviously great, talented producers. So it was shocking. It felt like Napa Valley was kind of the West Coast like hub of the wine industry, in the way that New York City felt like the East Coast hub of the wine industry. Now that could just be a completely narcissistic perspective, because it was like, oh, I'm here, so of course it's important now. But I think Napa has a way of attracting the best and the brightest in the industry. So we saw a lot of that, and that was very surprising and super cool. But I think it's also important to point out, not to give us too much credit, but Press wasn't really known for its wine at all when we came. It just had a single page list of wines on the back of the menu when we got here. So it was a very, very different restaurant than it is today. And in fact, both from a wine perspective, but also cuisine wise, because back then it was a steakhouse for our entire tenure. And then now,
Right.
now it's, more sort of French, and there's more tweezers involved, and they have a Michelin star. So it's a totally different concept. It just has the same name. It's gone through very significant evolution in the 15, 20 years it's been open.
So, at some point, you are working there, and you start on this book project, and that becomes a pretty significant thing, I guess, both for Napa, but just generally for the wine industry. So talk to me a little bit about the inspiration. Like, what was it that you were like, we we need this book, which was published in 2015, and you know, like I said, is a beautiful book. So what was the inspiration? What was that like?
Well, I think, you're in the wine industry, so I'm sure you get it. Like, the world of wine is very big. It requires a lot of study. And up to that point in my career, I put all of my energy into understanding, effectively just European wines. I'd worked harvest in Burgundy, and traveled in Europe. I was very focused on that. And so I knew nothing about California wine. And so when we made the decision, as a couple, to move to Napa Valley and run an all Napa wine list, I just felt completely unqualified. I thought, I know nothing about these wines, other than, thankfully, at least I understand what grapes they're using, but that's only because they happen to be French, for the most part. So I wanted to buy like the book, and so the story I tell in the beginning of the book, which is true, is that when I was young and went to Burgundy for a harvest, I took Clive Coates' Cote d'Or with me, and like in my suitcase, which, is a heavy, big book. And I read that thing cover to cover, so many times, just because I just wanted to have a base knowledge. I wanted to be taken seriously,
Right.
especially a young woman at the time, had a super baby face. Like, I wanted to really, prove that I knew my stuff. And so I was looking for that book to read before coming to Napa Valley, and it just simply didn't exist. And at that time, the general sort of there were kind of two trends going on in wine. The like marketing approach of wineries seemed to be about like mystery. Like, you'd go to their website and it would be no information, just like a little place where you could sign up for the mailing list. And meanwhile, like sommelier culture at that time, and I'm not sure that this has changed too much, but at the time, it was like 1,000 questions. Okay, well, who made this wine, and how much new oak is on this, and did they use native yeast, and so it was very kind of like minutia driven. So I was fielding questions from guests and other people in the trade about these wines we were serving, and I had no resources to get these answers. And so I just started to take tons of notes. So we would go and visit these producers, would just write everything down, ask all the questions, who was the winemaker in this year? How did you get started? What are the rootstocks? On and on and on. And started to compile this information. And then as I think eventually, well, pretty quickly, we started introducing older vintages to the wine list at press, which was also a bit unusual. And there also wasn't really any references other than the odd entry in Cellar Tracker to how those wines were drinking. Like critics weren't covering them, and all that. So I was just compiling this information. And so pretty quickly got the idea that this would make an interesting book. And so I ended up going back to Burgundy shortly after arriving in Napa with this idea in my head. And I was staying with Becky Wasserman, and she was this sort of collector of writers and authors. Like their house was like a modern day salon. There was just always these wine thought leaders there, kind of casually drinking, like, Ligier Belair and, pontificating about the future of wine. It was a really kind of fertile, creative, wonderful little environment. And I told her I was thinking about writing a wine, and she was like, "You must do it." Writing a book, and she was like, "You must do it. You have to do it." And then she started to tell other people we met that I was doing it. And then I thought, well, shit, I guess now I'm writing a book. So
Wow.
I came home and I started writing it in earnest, and it took about 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it was difficult enough that you took some time off before the next book, which I want to kind of compare and contrast, right? So
Sure.
your book, Wine Confident, um, has kind of a thesis around it, and it's a very different book. So talk to me a little bit about what inspired that, what caused you to lose your mind and try to write another book after how hard it is to write one. But
Yeah.
then a little bit about maybe um, how that changed a little bit of maybe your thinking, a little bit about how it is that we welcome people into this mysterious world we have.
Sure. And I have a lot of my thinking on that has changed a lot over the years. So I think the thing I would like to start out by saying is that the Napa book was self-published with a loan from Leslie Rudd. And so it took me 5 years to write the book, but then it took me, 5 years to sell enough books to pay that loan back. So it was 10 years, end to end of sort of my life with that book, like
Yeah.
actively thinking about it, working on it as a project. And so when that was over, I was like, that's it. I'm not doing
Right.
I'm not doing any more books. I'm glad I did it, but that was so hard. I can't imagine it. And true to my word, I did not do that. I did keep writing, but I transitioned to writing articles and things that are just a little bit more manageable. So fast forward, a bunch. I have a baby in 2020, a beautiful little girl. And while I'm on my maternity leave, Academy du Vin publishing house reaches out to me. Lane Chickon Brown, who's an author here and a dear friend, had recommended that I contribute to an anthology book they were doing called On California. And it was my maternity leave. And I'm not actually like saying people should work on their maternity leave, but I was like, I could bang this out. I could bang out a chapter. I can do this. So I put together an offering for that book, and it was really well received. The editor loved it. The publisher loved it. It was called out in a lot of the reviews as being like a very good chapter. And so now I'm on their radar, and I contributed to two other anthologies on Champagne and on Burgundy. And at this time, Academy du Vin Library was kind of quickly evolving to becoming like the main player in terms of wine books, right? They acquired the classic wine library, I think, and they're putting out books, like multiple books a year. So the editor that I had worked with, Sue Keevil, reached out to me saying that they had, very quickly kind of put out this wonderful library of reference works that were like really at kind of a higher level. And what they wanted to complement that was an introductory book. And they specifically wanted it written from a sommelier's perspective, since that part of the business has gotten really buzzy, right? And so she thought that I would be a great person to write it. So they actually pitched me on the book. And it was from the beginning always going to be a very different book than the Napa book because, first of all, it's an intro to wine book. They wanted it in a more conversational tone, but also I only had, I think, 9 months to write it.
Yeah.
Maybe even shorter, maybe 6 months to write it. By the time, by the time we signed the contract to when the book needed to go out, it was a pretty quick turnaround. So it just was going to be so much smaller. And that was actually really fun to write. Like that was a very different experience.
So let's kind of just talk about a few of these theses, because obviously you've been from kind of the heights, right? But also you're seeing all these people come into Napa, maybe more as tourists and stuff like that. So let's talk a little bit about the thesis of the book, and then maybe a couple of the things that you believed then that maybe now have even evolved in the few years since.
Yeah, so I think the overall, like the subtitle, so the name of the book is Wine Confident, and then the subtitle is There's No Wrong Way to Enjoy Wine, right? Which, is maybe softly provocative because I think inside the wine industry, especially at a certain level, there people feel there really is a right way to enjoy wine, that's, and everybody's perspective is different, but they're all really sure that it's the right way. Like, you decant in this way, you serve from this direction to that direction, you have this kind of glassware, like this pairs with this. And the reality is, the longer that I've been in the wine industry, especially having the benefit, and I do think it's a benefit of coming from a family that knows nothing about wine and, is really only kind of indulging me when they drink it, and just seeing the way that people that are new to wine receive wine speak, it was like, okay, this is such a disconnect. Like, the average person who is doing other things with their life and like only cares about wine tangentially, you know, there's a mismatch between like what they are willing and able to receive as like wine lessons and like what the wine intelligentsia like sort of wants to impose on them. And I think that what I began to understand is that, wine has some very problematic messages in terms of who it's for, in terms of what's at stake. It feels for a lot of people, wine feels like a test that you can fail, right? It feels like, and if you fail it, it's not just like, oh, I failed the test. It's like your whole personality failed. Like you're outing yourself as not being sophisticated enough or worldly enough, or you're in the wrong class, or there's very aristocratic, because we have all these quote unquote rules. And so I just started to really resist that, and I think change the way that I approach that. And I think that I wanted to encourage people to approach wine with a sense of like whimsy and like permission to play, instead of just like, here are the things you need to learn in order to like play this game the right way. It was more like, well, here are some tools that will hopefully make this exciting and easier to understand. So I both wanted to like simplify things and also like take some of the pressure off and be like, a lot of these things like, okay, we may drink wine out of these fancy crystal stemwares, but like transparent, varietally specific stemware has only existed since the 1950s. So, are you going to tell me that people didn't enjoy wine before this was invented? And also like people in, places, restaurants in Italy might even serve you great wine in what appears to be, water glass. So like, let's relax on some of this rules and this like wine shaming. And let's like get down to the fundamentals of what this is and how it can improve your life and how you can enjoy it. And I wanted to do it in a way that was not like necessarily demystifying, but in a way that assumed the reader was intelligent, and also leaned into and accepted that some of wine is mysterious, right? Like some of it is kind of romantic and squishy and not scientifically understood, and that's fine. So I came at this is way too long of a sentence to be a useful soundbite for anybody, but I think that the way I approached it was like with a sense of fun, you know, with a sense of intellectual interest. And I think, hopefully a sense of empowerment of just inviting more people in. That's what I was trying to achieve from the book.
And I guess because this is, I mean, by the time you're writing it, it's more than a decade after you're out in Napa. Is that really shaped? I mean, being frontline in Napa versus New York, did that really shape a lot of this thinking? Um, because I'd imagine that you're getting very fancy people in Napa, but you're getting a lot of people who are just trying to have a nice vacation too.
Well, I would say that my experience of living in Napa changed me as a wine professional in a lot of different ways. And one of the big ones was just for me, it sounds totally boring, maybe not quite such a revelation, but it reinforced to me that wine is grown and that it's an agricultural product, and that is very grounding, and it has a huge shape on the way wine is. I think when you're in a city and you're just dealing with like fancy bottles that come in wood boxes, and it feels like maybe wine is a product or it's an artifact of culture. But when you're actually out in wineland and you're living in a more agricultural space, like, this is a product of the earth. And I think that that is actually the perfect lens to view wine right now, because that aligns with a lot of the values of younger drinking generations that are coming up that are more environmentally conscious and things like that. So that was, I think, an important, kind of evolution in my understanding of wine in my career. And then the other piece is, like you said, I'm dealing often with people that are experiencing wine for the first time, or are at a really tender place in their wine journey where like they're excited, they want to know more, and you can see that it's like a fragile excitement that a couple of bad experiences, might shut that down. And so how do you talk to somebody like that? How do you encourage them to keep going? This was something I began to think a lot about, and I would hear things like a story I tell in the book, which really affected me, was a conversation with a woman who happened to take a wine class with me the day after she had gone to a winery. And she'd had this experience at the winery where she sat down, the host poured her a glass, she took a sip, and they immediately started grilling her. What do you taste in this glass? Now, that's not like an evil or a wrong thing for that host to do. It's a normal part of the wine dialogue. But this woman was immediately, she felt very like panicky and was like, well, it smells like wine to me. If you're asking me for like cherries or strawberries, I'm not getting that. So she's like, I guess she was so discouraged by the exchange, and she felt like she was somehow deficient, that she came to me and she was like, well, I really can't taste wine that well. I can't really appreciate it the way other people can. I think, wine's not for me. And that was this huge moment of understanding for me that a lot of the way that the wine industry talks about wine is like so description focused. It's like we're demanding a level of accuracy over an experience that is often really personal and like vague and poetic and not necessarily easily articulated. So, but we're demanding articulation in the way that we explain it rather than relying on other devices like poetic or um, anthropomorphic or what have you. And I think it's really turning a lot of people off. And there's a lot of ways in which we're turning people off wine, but the wine speak thing, I think, like the tasting note thing, that we've all kind of adopted, can be so alienating. And it's culturally alienating too. And a lot of people have um, talked a good deal about that, in the past years, about how these words that we use are also incredibly white and incredibly European, and that is also alienating and sending out signals. So that for me, I tried and I try increasingly to do as little of that as possible. And it's not to say that that's not a fun thing to do, to pick out those flavors and those aromas that are incredibly specific or relevant to your own background. I do it with my husband all the time, but
Of
we've been
course.
tasting wine together for 20 years. We know that we have the same like place of reference. talking to a stranger about wine, you're going to throw these specific words at them. You don't necessarily know how they're going to be received. So I tried to talk a lot in the book about how to talk about wine, because I do feel like for a lot of people, that's the impediment. They might find things they like, but then they can't explain it outward to get more of that. So there was a lot of coaching there. That was a big part of the book I spent a lot of time on.
Yeah, and I suppose there was this big trend in later 70s and early 80s with the color wheel and everything else that we've done, aroma wheel, that we were trying to standardize like the way we talked in the industry. And then somehow that bled into basically cutting everybody else off. And so it's kind of interesting that you were able to recognize that too and see that there's probably a better way to educate people, I guess, than the way we
For
had been.
Look, and it's valuable. Like you and I, as wine industry professionals, it's very helpful for us to have a shared language and like a standardized approach. But that's not necessarily useful to consumers, at least for a long period of time in their wine journey.
All right, so this is where I start talking about myself, and I make my opportunity to talk to you, Kelly,
Please.
about me. But one of the big things for me was our trips to Napa. So that was us getting away from the children. Little bit different story in the sense that I married somebody whose father owned a vineyard, so I knew how to
Oh,
pick grapes, but I didn't know how to taste. Um, Talk to me a little bit about whether or not you kind of agree with this thesis that wine travel is one of the ways, at least, at which that we can make wine both special and accessible to people.
oh, absolutely. I think wine travel is one of the greatest things there is, and you and I are not alone in thinking that, right? Like ecotourism and agrotourism and, wine experience based sort of wine getaways is hugely on the rise. And it's lifting up other regions that might not have enjoyed it before. So, in just speaking about California wine, Napa and Sonoma have always kind of dominated that. But as buying patterns and generational patterns kind of evolve, and this idea of experience based wine relations has grown, we're seeing huge numbers of tasting rooms open in places like Monterey and Mendocino, and why and more farmers becoming vertically integrated because they're able to sell direct to consumer more because there's more people visiting them. So I think a lot of people are waking up to the incredible richness of travel to wine country. And like I said, I think that it's really fundamental in reinforcing that this isn't just like a fancy thing. It's not like a watch, and it's also not just a beverage. It's also not just a beer, right? If it's sensitively made, if it's a good wine, it should be grown, and coming to wine country hopefully also introduces you to some of the people involved in its manufacture, and that creates relationships and deepens your emotional connection with wine. I mean, I think the emotional connection with wine is the fundamental, heart of the whole thing, right? Because hopefully anybody listening to this podcast has already bought into the notion that wine elicits a romantic response, right? And I think that, or an emotional response. And I think that we experience that while drinking it, in certain wines because of the aesthetic resonance. But then when you travel to wine country, you also deepen that in terms of your memories, the people you're with, the people you're meeting. It all becomes kind of knit into the experience of appreciating that wine and wine in general. So I think it's absolutely fantastic if you're able to do it.
So this is my favorite part because um, I get to ask you, what are you working on that you're most excited about? Because I spend so much time like living in your past, both preparing, but in my particular case, having visited, knowing your writing, things like that. So what are you working on now that you're most excited about?
Well, I work my day job for the last 7 years is at Meadowood in Napa Valley, teaching classes to guests, and I love that. I'm always working on refining the curriculum. I am working on a third book, which is a little bit too early stage to really talk about, but it's a photography book. I have a fantastic photographer lined up. Not my husband this time,
I
but
was gonna say.
no, a different photographer, and it's going to be a landscape book, and we're very excited about it, but it's I think several years away from completion, so that is very exciting. And I'm also getting kind of lumping my way through the master of wine process, so we'll see how that goes, but
and
that's quite a journey too.
Yeah, and it was funny because I guess because of your background, I kind of had this assumption. But how is it being a student versus being a educator? Because obviously you are doing both, right?
Well, I'd say they're very similar because, the best way to learn about something I have found is to teach. If you're on the hook for explaining a concept to somebody, there's no better motivator for me anyway than making sure that you really understand what you're talking about. So anytime I go to develop a new class or teach a new class, I first go into student mode. And that's great. But being in the master wine program, I'm a lot of people have gone through this. I really like it. I was in it briefly before I had a baby, and then the pandemic and being a mom kind of knocked me out, and I'm just back in as this year for the first time. And it's phenomenal because the master of wine program, in the same way that moving to wine country sort of stretched me beyond just thinking about wine in terms of like the object and the prestige and the liquid, to the whole like organism of wine and growing wine and the seasons and the land and the landscape. The master wine program is pushing me to think about wine beyond the tip of the wine iceberg, right? It's the entire industry, including bulk wine, including the sort of bottom shelf the grocery store wine, and thinking about the wine industry also as a whole, and not just thinking from a sommelier's perspective or like a fine wine perspective, but also what are retailers considering, what are sales and marketing departments considering, how does social media influence this landscape and all that kind of stuff. And so those aren't necessarily things that I would be thinking about living in wine country, writing articles about wine and teaching, wine classes. So I really love any opportunity to kind of stretch my understanding of wine. And so this has been helpful for that.
Well, thanks so much for doing this, Kelly. I really, really appreciate it. And hopefully, people get a chance to visit with you out in Napa. And obviously, at least two books that are out and one more on the way. So thanks again, Kelly, for doing this.
Thank you so much, John. I appreciate it.
You bet.